Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to be talking about Marc Nash's 28 Far Cries, a collection of flash fiction, 28 stories. Makes sense. And I just wanted to give my thoughts on this pretty soon. I'll give you like a rating and I'll give you non-spoiler thoughts, but a lot of what I had to say about this book will contain spoilers because with flash fiction it's only 2 or 3 pages. The most interesting things that I have to talk about involve the ending of the stories, and so I don't really see a way of talking about it effectively without spoiling some of these stories. I'm not going to be talking about all of them, just my favorites, but be warned, I'll let you know when I transition to that part, and so you can click away or whatever. Long story short, if you're here just for the rating, I gave it 5 stars. I found it exceptional. I usually don't even like flash fiction that much. You have to be a very economical and precise author, in my opinion, and eclectic to pull off flash fiction very well, and I don't think I've ever read flash fiction that was quite good until now. This has made me more interested in pursuing flash fiction, to be honest, which I had sort of discounted. I am not even a short story lover as much as most people because I tend to really like a story that I can grab a hold of, chew on, and deploys a theme and plot beats that are spaced out and breathe typically, but I have to say this is excellent and does the same amount of, maybe not the same amount of work, but it does a lot of work in making you springboard off of your thoughts. So it is obviously for me. Throughout this collection, you can tell that Nash is having a good time writing, which is just a quality that you like to see in all of the stuff that you're consuming. This feels a lot like Nash, I don't know, playing jazz or something, and is very playful, but still high specificity, good range of diction. I actually really admired his structure work insofar as paragraphs. Deciding what to contain in a paragraph in such a short work is very difficult, but seemed to always make a lot of sense, and the flow was never interrupted. The other cool thing about reading something like this is similar to short stories. If you don't like one, you just wait 2 pages and it's over, right? Some of these stories elicited more thoughts than others for me, but the ones that did resonated more so than most typical fiction, I would say. And I wonder if the subjectivity of each piece is the thing that is drawing me to it. I can't really say until I explore more about flash fiction and sort of what effect it has on me before I could even come to a conclusion like that. But it's possible that I'm reading more into these stories than is there, but then it seems like a format that is specifically there as a launching pad or a springboard or whatever you want to call it for specific thoughts, and not to form a specific subjective or prescriptive conclusion to the story, which is just pretty fascinating to me. I also found that Nash was very erudite at choosing verbiage, stuff that did a lot of work as conveying a lot of information in economical amounts of time. A lot of times the verb would communicate motion, tone, and numerous other things, and I continually noticed that. It would seem like a normal paragraph, and then certain words that were not out of place but higher diction were present specifically to draw the reader to a very specific thing that seemed important, and also again to communicate more information than a normal sentence structure construction would normally do, basically. And it felt like even that part of the structure in choosing the specific language and diction was also a topic. For instance, there's this story where an alien species was looking at Juicy Couture and sort of trying to figure out, in the same way that probably old people try to figure out what a meme is, you need more societal context to construct meaning out of it. And so you could comically come to the wrong conclusions and would. In fact, my parents also, when that was happening in high school, had similar thoughts. It was like an alienating experience for them, where they were, why are people walking around with juicy on their ass or strange sayings or whatever. One of my first jobs was working at a mall where they sold t-shirts like that, where it'd be like morning wood with a picture of a forest or other stupid things like that. It was like the beginnings of meme culture before or during computers were becoming ubiquitous in households. So there was a lot of interesting and fun, again, playfulness to the book. So I think everything else I need to go into would be spoilers, having to do with specific thoughts that I had on maybe 4 or 5 different of the stories. Since they're my favorite, they might be the strongest. Maybe they're not the strongest when you consume it, and it won't have any bearing on your reading of it. But in case it does, just be warned that I'm going to be talking about it. If you just want my thoughts without the spoilers, again, 5 stars, highly recommended. I grabbed it very cheap off of Book Depository, I think. It's also available on Amazon. It'll give you, I think, a good entry point to Marc Nash, which is how I'm using it. And then I will definitely pick up another book by Marc Nash after this one. So that being said, spoiler-wise, so to begin with, my favorite story is probably the beginning. I find it in the same way that it's like a skill that maybe is even lost, although probably not with Spotify playlists and stuff. Making a mixtape is an art form, especially, just go watch High Fidelity, they'll talk about it. But the first story is The Road to Nowhere, and it talks about roads in a very interesting way that makes you question what you're in for and anticipate what you're in for in the actual collection. Meaning it's a group of people that go off onto a road, but then it interrogates what a road is and what it is for. For instance, nowadays the only sort of dialogue or meaning that we derive from a road is usually that it is used to get from place A to B in a vehicle of some kind. But when you're hiking, it takes on like a very different meaning usually. There's always weird offshoots, especially around where I am. I live quite close to Banff National Park and Jasper, and there's a lot of hiking trails around here because it's the Rocky Mountains. And there's always very strange offshoots when you're hiking that I always find really interesting, like who is going off on these strange tangents and directions. I often tend to, maybe unrightly, think that it's people, the same type of people that pose with bears and cougars in their pictures and then get really confused and angry when they're admonished by parks and other tourists who are like, you're gonna get mauled, you're gonna die, etc. Why are you doing this? Similar feelings to people that go off the beaten path, really. In this story, these hikers go on this path, and basically essentially they don't continue to probe in this path because they are afraid of the meaningfulness of it. And at the end it says, minds with nothing to fix on were in danger of devouring themselves. They decided there were to be no more trips. They could advance no further than they had managed to attain on the last journey. Their nerve had failed them. What need had they of knowledge of what lay beyond? Rather than pose them any threat, the road was their protector. It kept them from wandering, from encountering the dark, unknown parts of themselves. And so, well, for one, I just really like that ending to a fairly innocuous beginning where it's just talking about roads. But as a reader, you're wondering, what path are you on, right? Like, are you on the protected path, or are you being signaled by Nash that you're off the beaten path and you will be like encountering some strange things. So as a setup for a collection, I just really like that because you're anticipating what road you're on, where you're going, what the path is, what's happening, and it sort of makes you aware that Nash is probably going to be looking at perception and constructions, not societal constructs as much as what meaning do archaic or antiquated things have in our lives these days. And I think that mostly holds true. There's of course some stories that aren't like that, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that is. For instance, the next story is the story of a mummified man who is discovered, and again, its relationship to the modern, it has widely changed in a somewhat comical way again, but just in a fundamental perception of what a man who is mummified and how they would interact with the world again is quite different. Then a man wakes up with the language imprinted on his brain, and he's unable to communicate with people, which I found very interesting because it's the only source of kind of agency that anybody generally has in their life, or at least their first source of agency. And the only thing that everybody he interacts with is able to do is attempt to commodify it, define it in strange terms that are not actually useful, and it eventually leads to the ubiquitous dismissal of all, at least ostensible, agency from everybody, because these people in a post-capitalistic society are trying to deride what any sort of impactful or meaningful relationship to something that archaic and antiquated is. It's another sort of playful jest by Nash that I thought was very excellent. So I could talk about a lot of these, but as an example of a paragraph that I thought was great use of language and diction to convey a lot of meaning, for instance, in Off Color, what I really liked for this sentence was, while his wife's face alternated between puce rage and puffy cerise, when the tears absconded and burnished the skin channels they plowed. Flat and wan his words may have been, but at least they followed the faithful speech rhythms to preserve the shape of their meaning. Unlike those words of his wife shredded into sawn-off syllables and babbled phenoms, as determined by the serrated punctuation of her heaving sobs or her welter of tidal emotion that swamped all utterance entirely. Like, that's just what we're reading for, basically, right? There is so much communicated in that short paragraph. It's just exceptional craft work, in my opinion. That's the kind of description, specificity that I'm looking for in most of my reading. And then the final story that I wanted to talk about is Lord of War, which I found very comical, but also very affecting in some ways, because it is about a Mongol conqueror who has that, what is that line? No, I weep for mine enemies because I have no one left to conquer. And when you think about that actual sentence, it has like a accord with the cultural consciousness in a way that, like, everybody accepts that line, but they don't interrogate what it actually means. And this story somewhat does that, but this conqueror is crying and all of his men don't know how to relate to him whatsoever because he is crying. They possess none of the tools to interrogate or examine him in any meaningful way, because the only language or words that they know in their language to communicate with him is all these different paragraphs about where they might have screwed up and made him sad, which is like when they completely commit genocide and all these atrocities against these people. Did we screw up when we weren't very effective against this? Or maybe when we did this, but it was also necessary that we did this. And we are led to believe that probably the outcome of this story is that the Mongol Lord is going to reflect on his life and think like, oh yeah, that was pretty bad, but instead it's just that he has no enemies. I think as a commentary on toxic masculinity, it's just completely perfect and a little bit subversive of reader expectations when you get to it, because the story seems to be leading you somewhere, but instead it, withholds the catharsis. And in the withholding of catharsis, it sort of parallels the fact that these people are unable to communicate effectively with their leader, because now that the war is over, everything is conquered, they don't actually have the ability to communicate with each other anyway. The only language is war, and war is over. So what happens then, right? And so what happens to boys when they're, unable to play war, right? So it's also a parallel to, I think, war fiction and PTSD and the results of war and stuff like that. And that might be reading, again, as I said, I might be reading a lot into these stories, but they do act, I think, as a kind of springboard to get your mind working and further contemplate these stories beyond their short life cycle, basically. I'd be interested in your thoughts on flash fiction in general, as well as 28 Far Cry specifically. And if you've read any other Marc Nash books, I'd love to know what is a good point to go from here. I only found a couple of his titles to buy from Book Depository and Amazon, and there's a bunch here like A, B, and E, Not in My Name, Time After Time, An Eye for an Eye for an Eye, and these other flash fictions as well. All of these I don't see listed, so maybe he has a website where you can specifically order these things. I'll have to look into that, but I'm able to get his Stories We Tell Our Children and 3 Dreams in the Key of G, I believe, and that's the only ones available. So if you've read any of those, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, I'll see you next video. Hope you're having a pleasant week, evening, day, what have you, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.